I will never forget the moment my own daughter looked me straight in the eye and reduced 40 years of motherhood to hired help. Standing in the marble foyer of the Riverside Country Club, wearing my best navy dress and clutching a homemade pumpkin pie, I watched Jessica smile that practiced socialite smile as she gestured toward me dismissively. "Oh, this is Maggie," she announced to her circle of designer-clad friends. "She's helping us out with the kids tonight. You know how hard it is to find good childcare during the holidays." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not my mother. Not the woman who raised me. Not even a family friend. Just Maggie, the babysitter. A stranger hired for the evening to watch Emma and Luke while the real family enjoyed their exclusive Thanksgiving charity dinner. The laughter and conversation around me faded into white noise as I stood there, invisible among women whose handbags cost more than most people's monthly rent, realizing that my own flesh and blood was ashamed of me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone has always called me Maggie. At 67, I've lived through enough to recognize when someone is trying to erase your existence, even when that someone is your own child. For 40 years, I dedicated my life to pediatric nursing at Salem General Hospital, spending countless nights comforting frightened children and exhausted parents. I thought I understood families, thought I knew what love and loyalty looked like. Apparently, I was wrong about my own. The evening had started with such promise. After 8 months of navigating widowhood alone in my empty Salem house, I had been genuinely excited when Jessica called to invite me to the annual Riverside Country Club Thanksgiving charity dinner. "It's going to be wonderful, Mom," she had gushed over the phone, her voice bright with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard since Tom's funeral. "All the kids will be there, and you'll finally get to meet some of my friends from the club. Ryan thinks it's time we include you more in our social circle." I should have known something was off. Ryan never wanted to include me in anything. My son-in-law had made his feelings about me crystal clear over the years through 1,000 small slights and calculated oversights. Birthday dinners scheduled without consulting my availability. Holiday photos arranged while I was conveniently in the restroom. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. But Jessica seemed so hopeful, so genuinely excited about bringing me into their world that I pushed aside my reservations and focused on the joy of being wanted. I spent 3 days preparing for that dinner. Not just the pumpkin pie, though I made it from scratch using Tom's mother's recipe, the one that had won blue ribbons at the county fair for 15 consecutive years. I also spent hours agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on the navy wool dress I had bought for Tom's memorial service because it was the most expensive thing in my closet. I even splurged on having my silver hair professionally styled at the salon, something I hadn't done since Tom passed away. The drive from Salem to Riverside took exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes, every mile filled with nervous anticipation. I had printed out directions even though my phone had GPS, prepared conversation topics about current events and local happenings, and practiced smiling in my rearview mirror at red lights. I wanted so desperately to make a good impression on Jessica's friends, to prove that I was worthy of being part of their sophisticated world. Riverside had always intimidated me. Where Salem was comfortable and familiar with its mix of working families and retirees, Riverside was something else entirely. Manicured lawns that looked like golf courses, houses that belonged in architectural magazines, cars that cost more than I had made in some years as a nurse. The Riverside Country Club sat at the heart of it all, a sprawling Tudor revival mansion, surrounded by perfectly landscaped gardens and a golf course that stretched to the Columbia River. I had been to the club only twice before, both times for events Jessica insisted I attend. The first was Emma's 5th birthday party, where I spent the afternoon feeling underdressed and out of place among mothers who discussed their children's tutors and European vacations with casual indifference. The second was Luke's kindergarten graduation celebration, where I sat alone at a table in the corner, while Jessica flitted between groups of women who all seemed to share inside jokes and exclusive experiences. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, Jessica had specifically invited me to be part of her social circle, not just an awkward appendage tolerated for family obligation. As I pulled into the club's circular driveway, my heart was actually racing with excitement. The valet who took my keys was polite and professional, and I felt almost elegant walking up the stone steps in my good dress and low heels. The interior of the club never failed to take my breath away. Soaring ceilings with exposed wooden beams, oil paintings of local landscapes in heavy gold frames, Persian rugs that probably cost more than my annual pension. The Thanksgiving charity dinner was being held in the main ballroom, decorated with elegant autumn arrangements and soft lighting that made everything look like a scene from a magazine. I found Jessica near the bar, resplendent in a burgundy silk dress that I knew must have cost a fortune. She looked every inch the successful Riverside wife, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo, her makeup flawless, her jewelry understated, but obviously expensive. When she saw me approaching, her smile seemed genuine, warm even. "Mom, you made it," she exclaimed, air kissing both my cheeks in that affected way she had adopted since moving to Riverside. "You look lovely. Is that a new dress?" I felt a flush of pride. "No, but I had it professionally pressed, and I brought the pumpkin pie you requested." I held up the covered dish, suddenly self-conscious about the simple ceramic pie plate among all the crystal and silver surrounding us. "Perfect," Jessica said, though she was already looking past me toward a group of women who had just entered the ballroom. "Come on, I want you to meet some people." Ryan appeared at her elbow as if summoned, immaculate in his charcoal suit, and burgundy tie that perfectly matched Jessica's dress. At 38, my son-in-law was undeniably handsome in that polished country club way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair that he claimed made him look distinguished, and the kind of confident smile that had probably closed 1,000 real estate deals. He had never liked me, not from the moment Jessica first brought him home 6 years ago, though he was far too socially adept to let his disdain show publicly. "Maggie," he said now, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced warmth that I had learned to recognize over the years. "How wonderful that you could join us tonight. The charity auction should be quite exciting. They're raising money for underprivileged children's holiday programs." The irony wasn't lost on me. A room full of people who spent more on their monthly country club dues than most families earned in 6 months, raising money for children who couldn't afford Thanksgiving dinner. But I smiled and nodded appropriately, because I had learned long ago that pointing out such contradictions only marked you as someone who didn't belong. "It's a wonderful cause," I replied, meaning it despite my cynicism about the setting. As a pediatric nurse, I had seen too many children who needed exactly the kind of help this charity provided. Jessica was already moving toward her group of friends, practically vibrating with social energy. I followed a few steps behind, clutching my pie and trying to project confidence I didn't feel. The women were arranged in a loose circle near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the golf course, all of them perfectly coiffed and expensively dressed, holding crystal glasses of wine and speaking in the kind of modulated tones that suggested years of private school education. This was the moment I had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. My introduction to Jessica's inner circle, my chance to prove that I could fit into their world despite my background and modest means. I straightened my shoulders and prepared to smile, to be charming and interesting, to make Jessica proud of me. Instead, I watched my daughter's face transform into something I barely recognized. The warm, genuine smile she had worn when greeting me was replaced by something cooler, more calculated. Her posture shifted, becoming more erect and formal, and when she spoke, Her voice carried a tone of casual dismissal that cut straight through me. "Oh, this is Maggie," she said, not even looking at me as she made the introduction. "She's helping us out with the kids tonight. You know how hard it is to find good childcare during the holidays." The words echoed in my head as if spoken in a cathedral. Helping us out with the kids. Good childcare. Not my mother. Not the woman who had raised me single-handedly after my father died when I was 8. Not the person who had worked double shifts to pay for my college education, who had been present for every milestone, every heartbreak, every triumph of my life. Just Maggie, the hired help. The women in the circle barely glanced at me, their attention already shifting back to their previous conversation about ski vacations and private school applications. One of them, a redhead wearing what I suspected were real pearls, nodded vaguely in my direction before turning to Jessica. "You're so lucky to have found reliable help," she said. "Our last nanny quit right before our trip to Vail. Do you have her number? I might need backup for New Year's Eve." I stood there, invisible, as they discussed me in the third person, as if I were a piece of furniture. Jessica laughed and promised to share my contact information, playing along with the charade she had created. I watched my daughter, this woman I had loved and sacrificed for and been so proud of, participate in my erasure with apparent ease. The conversation flowed around me, about topics I couldn't contribute to, because they required experiences I had never had, and money I had never possessed. Private jet trips to Martha's Vineyard, personal trainers and yoga retreats, children's summers at exclusive camps that cost more than I had made in some months. I stood there with my homemade pie, feeling more foolish and out of place with each passing minute. Emma and Luke appeared at my side, my beautiful grandchildren dressed in miniature versions of adult formal wear. Emma wore a navy velvet dress with a white collar, her dark hair braided with small white ribbons. Luke was in a tiny suit complete with bow tie, his hair slicked back with what was probably more hair product than I used in a month. They looked like something out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement, perfect little accessories to their parents. Carefully curated image. "Grandma Maggie," Emma whispered, pressing close to my leg. "Are you really our babysitter tonight?" The question pierced straight through my heart. Even at 8 years old, Emma understood that something was wrong with how her mother had introduced me. I knelt down to her level, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'm always your grandmother first, sweetheart," I told her quietly. "Nothing can ever change that." Luke, at 6, was less aware of the social dynamics, but clearly confused by the atmosphere. "Why can't you sit with us at dinner, Grandma? Mommy said you have to sit at the kids' table." The kids' table, of course. Not only had Jessica introduced me as the babysitter, but she had relegated me to supervising the children's section while she and Ryan enjoyed the adult festivities. I was being paid for my services not with money, but with humiliation. I glanced up to see Jessica watching our interaction with what looked like annoyance. She approached us with that bright, brittle smile she wore when trying to manage potentially awkward situations. "Kids, let Maggie get settled," she said, her tone suggesting that my name was just another service provider title, like caterer or florist. "The children's activities start in a few minutes. There's face painting and a craft station set up in the side room." She was directing me to my duties, making it clear that my role for the evening was childcare, not family participation. I stood slowly, my knees protesting after years of hospital, floors and my heart protesting something far worse. "Of course," I heard myself say, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else. "Come on, kids. Let's see what activities they have planned." As I led Emma and Luke toward the children's area, I caught a glimpse of Jessica rejoining her circle of friends, already laughing at something one of them had said. Ryan was nearby, holding court among a group of men who were probably discussing golf handicaps and investment portfolios. Neither of them looked in my direction. I had been successfully categorized and dismissed. reduced to my functional role and forgotten. The children's area was actually quite lovely, decorated with autumn themes and stocked with age-appropriate activities clearly designed to keep young ones occupied while their parents socialized. Several other children were already there, most of them around Emma and Luke's ages, all dressed in the kind of expensive children's clothing that required dry cleaning. I wasn't the only adult supervising, but I was clearly the only grandmother among the hired childcare staff. The others were young women, probably college students earning extra money during the holiday break. They were friendly and professional, treating me with the kind of respectful courtesy one service provider shows another. As I helped Luke with a turkey craft made from construction paper and googly eyes, I tried to process what had just happened. My own daughter had publicly disowned me, reducing our relationship to a financial transaction. She had invited me to this elegant event not as her mother, not as Emma and Luke's beloved grandmother, but as unpaid domestic help. The rational part of my mind understood that Jessica was under social pressure in this environment. Riverside was all about appearances, about projecting success and sophistication. Having a mother who was a retired nurse from Salem, who drove a 10-year-old Honda and shopped at discount stores, didn't fit the image she was trying to project. But understanding it intellectually didn't make the emotional blow any less devastating. Emma settled beside me with her face painting butterfly still drying, her small hand finding mine. "Grandma, are you sad?" she asked with that uncanny perceptiveness that children sometimes possess. I squeezed her fingers gently. "A little bit, sweetheart. But being with you and Luke makes me feel much better." It was true. My grandchildren were the bright spots in an increasingly complicated relationship with their parents. Emma's curiosity about everything from flowers to physics, Luke's endless energy and infectious giggle. They loved me unconditionally, without regard for my bank account or social status or ability to enhance their parents' image. The evening continued with excruciating slowness. I supervised crafts and games, helped with bathroom breaks, and mediated minor disputes between children who were clearly accustomed to having their every wish immediately granted. Through the archway separating the children's area from the main ballroom, I could see Jessica and Ryan mingling effortlessly among their peers, Jessica's laughter carrying across the room like silver bells. During dinner, served on child-sized plates at appropriately scaled tables, Emma asked why I wasn't eating with the grown-ups. I explained that sometimes adults have different dinner parties, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. The truth was too complicated and too hurtful to share with an 8-year-old. The charity auction was visible from our vantage point, and I watched wealthy couples bid casually on vacation packages and artwork that represented more money than I had ever seen in one place. Jessica and Ryan participated enthusiastically. Their paddles raised for a wine country weekend that eventually sold for $3,000. The amount was more than I spent on groceries in 6 months, bid without apparent thought or financial strain. As the evening wound down and parents began collecting their children, Jessica finally appeared in the kids' area. She had clearly been drinking wine throughout the dinner, her cheeks slightly flushed and her movements a bit more animated than usual. "How were they?" she asked, as if inquiring about my professional performance rather than checking on her own children. "Perfect, as always," I replied, helping Luke gather his craft projects. "They're wonderful kids, Jess." She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We should probably get going. School night tomorrow, and Emma has her piano lesson right after classes." The drive home was awkward, with Jessica and Ryan discussing the evening's social highlights, while I sat in the back seat with the children, feeling like exactly what I had been introduced as: hired help being transported home after completing my duties. They dropped me at my car in the club parking lot with perfunctory thanks and air kisses, Emma and Luke's genuine hugs the only bright moment in the entire experience. The 2-hour drive back to Salem gave me plenty of time to think, though my thoughts kept circling back to the same painful realization. Somewhere along the way, I had lost my daughter. Not to death or distance, but to ambition and social climbing and the insidious pressure of trying to belong in a world that valued wealth over character. Jessica hadn't always been like this. Growing up, she had been a thoughtful, compassionate child who volunteered at animal shelters and tutored struggling classmates. She had chosen marketing as a career because she wanted to help small businesses succeed, and she had met Ryan during her first job at a Portland advertising agency where they both worked 60-hour weeks and shared dreams of making a difference. But Riverside had changed her, or perhaps revealed parts of her personality that had always existed, but remained dormant until she found herself in an environment where they were not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. The Jessica who had introduced me as the babysitter was someone I barely recognized, someone who could calculated sacrifice family relationships for social advancement. As I pulled into my driveway in Salem, the house dark and empty as it had been for 8 months since Tom's death, I felt the full weight of my isolation. My husband was gone. My daughter was ashamed of me. My grandchildren were being raised in a world where worth was measured by material possessions rather than character or love. But even in that moment of profound sadness, I felt something else stirring. Not just hurt, though there was plenty of that. Not just disappointment, though that was overwhelming, but also a kind of anger, clean and sharp and surprisingly energizing. I had spent 40 years caring for other people's children, sacrificing my own comfort and convenience to ensure their well-being. I had raised Jessica to be better than what I had witnessed tonight. If my daughter wanted to treat me like hired help, perhaps it was time she learned exactly what that kind of relationship actually cost. Inside my quiet house, surrounded by 40 years of memories and love, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to think about what came next. The evening had been humiliating, painful, and revelatory, but it had also been educational. I now understood exactly where I stood in Jessica's priorities, and more importantly, I was beginning to understand my own worth independent of her approval. The story was far from over. In fact, I was beginning to suspect it was just beginning. The phone call came exactly 12 days after the country club humiliation, though I had been expecting it much sooner. Ryan's voice carried that particular tone of manufactured warmth that I had learned to recognize as a warning signal, smooth and practiced like a sales pitch designed to disarm resistance before delivering the real message. "Maggie, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," he began, though he had never shown concern for my schedule before. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we realize we may have put you in an awkward position at the charity dinner. We want to make it up to you." I set down my coffee cup carefully, settling into the worn armchair that had been Tom's favorite reading spot. Through the kitchen window, I could see my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, raking leaves in her yard, the mundane, autumn ritual. A stark contrast to the calculated conversation unfolding over the phone. "That's thoughtful of you, Ryan," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Though I'm not sure what you mean by awkward position." A slight pause, as if he was recalibrating his approach. "Well, we know how much you love spending time with Emma and Luke, and we were thinking it might be nice to formalize that arrangement, make it more regular, more beneficial for everyone involved." Formalize the arrangement. The phrase sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't yet identify why. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Jessica has been struggling with the children's after-school schedule," Ryan continued, his tone becoming more animated as he warmed to his pitch. "You know how demanding her volunteer work at the hospital auxiliary has become, and with my real estate development projects requiring more travel, we need someone reliable to help with Emma and Luke, someone who truly cares about them." The caw. Flattery was expertly deployed, appealing to my genuine love for my grandchildren while positioning the arrangement as something I should be grateful for rather than a favor I would be providing. I remained silent, waiting for him to reveal the true nature of this sudden concern for childcare logistics. "We were thinking you could move closer to Riverside," Ryan pressed on. "Maybe find a nice little apartment near the children's school." That way you could pick them up, help with homework, provide the kind of stability they need while Jessica and I handle our professional obligations. A nice little apartment. The condescension was barely concealed behind his seemingly considerate suggestion. Not a home, not a place where I could build a life, but a convenient staging area for my services as unpaid childcare provider. And what would happen to my house here in Salem? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the direction this conversation was heading. That's actually the exciting part, Ryan said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. The Salem real estate market has been incredibly strong lately. Houses like yours are selling well above asking price. You could probably clear a substantial profit, maybe $200,000 or more after paying off your mortgage. $200,000. The figure hung in the air between us like bait on a hook, dangling just close enough to seem attainable while concealing the sharp metal beneath. I had indeed been considering selling the house since Tom's death. It felt too large and too full of memories for one person, and the maintenance was becoming challenging on my pension income. But Ryan's suggestion came with implications that made my stomach tighten with unease. That's an interesting observation about the market, I said carefully, though I haven't actually decided whether I want to sell. Of course, Ryan agreed quickly. But if you were considering it anyway, the timing couldn't be better, and it would solve so many problems for all of us. Emma and Luke would have their grandmother nearby, Jessica would have reliable help with the children, and you'd have a nice nest egg to make your retirement more comfortable. The way he framed it made refusing seem almost selfish, as if my hesitation stemmed from a lack of concern for my grandchildren's well-being rather than suspicion about his true motives. It was expertly manipulative, acknowledging my autonomy, while making it clear that the expected answer was enthusiastic agreement. It's certainly something to think about, I replied non-committally. Though moving at my age isn't a decision I'd make lightly. Absolutely, Ryan said, though his tone suggested he viewed my age as an asset to his argument rather than a complication. That's why we want to help make the transition as smooth as possible. In fact, we've already identified a perfect apartment complex in Riverside. Willow Creek condominiums. Very nice, very safe, with a shuttle service to the shopping center. The fact that he had already scouted housing options without consulting me revealed the presumptuous nature of his planning. This wasn't a spontaneous suggestion born from genuine concern about childcare arrangements. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme that had been developed over time, probably discussed extensively between him and Jessica before this phone call. "You've been busy," I observed dryly. "Just trying to be helpful," Ryan replied, missing or ignoring my sarcasm. The units at Willow Creek are quite reasonable. A 2-bedroom runs about $1,800 a month, which would leave you plenty of cushion from your house sale for other expenses. $1,800 a month. My current mortgage payment was less than half that amount, and I owned 40% equity in my Salem house. The financial implications of his suggestion were becoming clearer, and they weren't in my favor. I would be trading ownership for rental payments, stability for dependence, independence for proximity to my grandchildren that came with strings attached. That seems expensive for what I'd be getting, I said. But think about what you'd be gaining, Ryan countered smoothly. Daily contact with Emma and Luke, the chance to be a central part of their lives instead of a weekend visitor, the convenience of being close to excellent medical facilities and shopping. And Jessica would love having you nearby. She's been saying how much she misses having family support. Family support. The phrase was particularly galling given how Jessica had treated me at the country club dinner, but I recognized it as another carefully chosen manipulation. Ryan was reframing my potential role as grandmother and family member, while simultaneously making it clear that this role came with job responsibilities that would be expected rather than appreciated. I'd need to think about all the implications, I said. It's a big change. Of course, Ryan agreed readily, though I should mention that the timing might be important. The real estate market is so hot right now, but these things can shift quickly. And the apartment at Willow Creek won't stay available forever. Units there are in high demand. Artificial urgency, designed to pressure me into making a decision before I had time to fully consider the ramifications. It was a classic sales technique, one that Tom had taught me to recognize during his years in hospital administration when vendors would try to rush him into equipment purchases. "I appreciate you thinking of me," I said, "but I'll need some time to consider all the factors involved." A brief silence, followed by what sounded like a sigh. "I understand, Maggie. It's just that Jessica has been under so much stress lately, with her committee work and the children's schedules. She really needs the support." There it was, the guilt trip wrapped in concern for my daughter. If I didn't immediately agree to upend my life to provide convenient childcare, I was being selfish and unsupportive of Jessica's needs. Never mind that Jessica's stress stemmed from overcommitting to social activities designed to enhance her status rather than from any genuine hardship. "What kind of committee work is keeping her so busy?" I asked, genuinely curious about this volunteer activity that apparently required regular childcare support. "Oh, you know Jessica," Ryan said, with a laugh that sounded forced. "She's involved in everything. The hospital auxiliary board, the children's school fundraising committee, the country club's charity planning group. She's really made a name for herself in the community." Made a name for herself? I wondered if that name included being known as the woman whose mother was relegated to the children's table at formal dinners. But I kept that observation to myself, focusing instead on the practical implications of what Ryan was proposing. "And these commitments require daily after-school childcare?" I pressed. "Well, not every day," Ryan admitted, "but you know how unpredictable these things can be. Emergency meetings, last-minute events, networking opportunities that come up. Suddenly, having reliable backup would give Jessica the flexibility she needs to really excel in these roles." Reliable backup. Not grandmother, not family member, not valued participant in my grandchildren's lives. Backup. A substitute to be called upon when more important priorities arose. The language revealed exactly how Ryan viewed my potential role in their family structure. "I see," I said quietly. "Plus, there's another benefit I haven't mentioned," Ryan continued, his voice taking on a more confidential tone. "My development project on the Columbia River waterfront is moving into the next phase, and I'll be traveling more frequently to meet with investors and contractors. Jessica could really use the extra support during those times." The Columbia River project. I had heard fragments about this development over the past year, usually mentioned in passing during family dinners when Ryan was discussing his various business ventures. From what I understood, it involved converting an old industrial site into luxury condominiums and retail space, the kind of high-end development that Riverside specialized in. "That sounds like an exciting opportunity," I said neutrally. "It really is," Ryan agreed, his enthusiasm becoming more genuine for the first time in our conversation. "We're talking about a $20 million development, Maggie. 60 luxury units with river views, high-end retail space, marina access. It's going to completely transform that section of the waterfront." $20 million. The figure was so large I could barely comprehend it, representing more money than I had ever imagined being involved in a single project. But something about Ryan's tone when he mentioned the development made me curious about why he was sharing these financial details with me. "That's certainly ambitious," I observed. "The returns are going to be incredible," Ryan continued. "We're projecting at least 30% profit margins, possibly more, depending on market conditions. The investors who get in early are going to see substantial returns." Investors who get in early. The phrase hung in the air like a fishing lure, bright and attractive and designed to trigger a specific response. I felt the first stirrings of understanding about why Ryan had called, why he was suddenly so concerned about my housing situation and childcare availability. "It sounds like you have the financing well in hand," I said carefully. Actually, that's where things get interesting, Ryan replied, his voice taking on a more intimate, conspiratorial quality. We're in the final stages of securing the primary funding, but there's an opportunity for additional private investors to join the project at the ground level. People who want to be part of something transformative while also seeing excellent returns on their investment. There it was, the real reason for this phone call, delivered after 20 minutes of carefully orchestrated buildup about childcare needs and housing arrangements. Ryan wasn't calling because he was concerned about Jessica's stress or Emma and Luke's after-school supervision. He was calling because he needed money and he had identified me as a potential source. Private investors, I repeated slowly. Exactly, Ryan said, his enthusiasm building as he sensed an opening. The minimum investment is typically quite high for projects like this, but because you're family, I could arrange for a smaller stake. Maybe $50,000, which would give you a meaningful position while still being manageable from your perspective. $50,000. Nearly a quarter of what he estimated I could clear from selling my house, presented as a family favor rather than the substantial financial risk it actually represented. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity and sophistication. That's very generous of you to consider me, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Family should benefit from family success, Ryan replied, smoothly. And with your house sale providing the capital, the timing works perfectly. You could move closer to the grandchildren, invest in a project that will benefit the entire community, and set yourself up for a very comfortable retirement. The pieces of his scheme were fitting together with crystalline clarity. Convince me to sell my house and move to an expensive rental apartment nearby. Use the emotional leverage of increased access to my grandchildren to make the arrangement seem appealing. Then position a substantial investment in his development project as a family opportunity rather than a financial risk. If successful, he would gain both convenient childcare for his wife and capital for his business venture, while I would lose the security of homeownership and a significant portion of my savings. It's a lot to consider all at once, I said. I understand completely, Ryan replied, though his tone suggested impatience with my lack of immediate enthusiasm. But opportunities like this don't come along often, Maggie. The Columbia River development is going to be a landmark project, something that will define Riverside's growth for the next decade. Being part of that from the beginning is special. Being part of that. More manipulation, making it sound like I would be joining an exclusive club rather than risking money I couldn't afford to lose on a project I didn't understand. I thought about Tom, who had always taught me to be suspicious of investment opportunities that required quick decisions and came with emotional pressure. I'd need to see the actual investment prospectus, I said. Financial projections, market analysis, that sort of thing. A slight pause, as if Ryan hadn't expected me to ask for documentation. Of course. Though I should mention that the informal family arrangement I'm offering isn't the same as the formal investor packages. Those require much higher minimum investments and come with more complex legal structures. In other words, he wanted my money without providing the protections and transparency that legitimate investors would receive. The red flags were multiplying rapidly, each one more obvious than the last. I see, I said simply. But I can certainly put together some information for you, Ryan continued quickly. Project timelines, profit projections, that sort of thing. Would it be helpful if Jessica and I came down to Salem this weekend to go over everything in person? The suggestion of an in-person meeting sent another warning signal through my mind. Face-to-face pressure was always more intense than phone conversations, harder to resist, and more difficult to escape if the situation became uncomfortable. Ryan was clearly prepared to escalate his approach if necessary. That's not necessary, I replied. If you could email me some basic information, I could review it first, and then we could talk again. Absolutely, Ryan agreed, though something in his tone suggested this wasn't his preferred approach. I'll put something together tonight and send it over. Though I should mention that we're hoping to finalize the private investor group within the next few weeks, so timing is somewhat important. More artificial urgency, designed to prevent me from taking time to properly evaluate the proposal or seek independent advice. Every element of Ryan's approach was textbook manipulation, from the initial emotional hook about helping with the grandchildren to the investment opportunity presented as a family favor. I understand, I said. I'll review whatever you send, as quickly as possible. Perfect, Ryan replied, his voice brightening as if my agreement to review information was the same as agreement to invest. And Maggie, I really think this could be the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. You closer to the kids, Jessica less stressed, and everyone benefiting from the project's success. A new chapter. If only he knew how accurate that description might prove to be, though probably not in the way he intended. After ending the call, I sat in Tom's chair for a long time, staring out at Mrs. Patterson's now perfectly raked yard while processing the conversation. The manipulation had been expertly crafted, layered with emotional appeals and financial incentives designed to make resistance seem unreasonable. But it had also revealed something important about Ryan's character and circumstances. Legitimate business opportunities didn't require this level of personal pressure and emotional manipulation. Successful developers didn't need to target their mothers-in-law for investment capital. Something about the Columbia River project wasn't as solid as Ryan was pretending. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching Willow Creek condominiums online, discovering that Ryan's cost estimates were accurate, but that the complex catered primarily to divorced individuals and elderly people who had sold their homes for cash flow. The marketing materials emphasized convenience and low maintenance, qualities that appeal to people who had given up the independence of homeownership for the simplicity of rental living. The online reviews were mixed, with several residents complaining about thin walls, limited parking, and management that was slow to respond to maintenance issues. It was exactly the kind of place someone would end up if they made hasty decisions about selling their home without thoroughly investigating alternatives. That evening, Jessica called. Her voice was bright with forced enthusiasm, clearly continuing the campaign that Ryan had initiated. "Mom, Ryan told me about your conversation today," she began without preamble. "I'm so excited about the possibility of having you closer. The kids would absolutely love it." "It's an interesting idea," I replied carefully, "though it would be a major change." "But a good change," Jessica insisted. "You've seemed so lonely since Dad died, rattling around in that big house by yourself. Being near family would be so much better for you." The concern about my loneliness felt calculated rather than genuine, especially given how little effort Jessica had made to address that loneliness over the past 8 months. She had visited Salem exactly 3 times since Tom's funeral, each visit brief and focused more on her own needs than on my adjustment to widowhood. "I've been managing," I said. "I know you have," Jessica replied quickly. "You're so strong, Mom, but you don't have to manage everything alone anymore. We want to help, to be more involved in your life. More involved in my life." The phrase was particularly ironic, given that her most recent involvement had been introducing me as hired help at a formal dinner. But I recognized the technique she was using, reframing my potential role as something being offered to me rather than something being requested of me. "Ryan mentioned some kind of investment opportunity as well," I said, curious to see how Jessica would handle this aspect of their proposal. "Oh, the Columbia River project," Jessica said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Mom, it's going to be incredible. Ryan has been working on it for over a year, and it's finally coming together. The location is perfect, right on the water with mountain views. The kind of place people will pay premium prices to live." Premium prices. I wondered if Jessica understood the financial risks involved in development projects, or if she was simply repeating Ryan's optimistic projections without considering the potential downsides. "It sounds ambitious," I said neutrally. Ryan has such vision, Jessica continued, her pride in her husband evident despite everything. He can see what places could become, not just what they are now. The Columbia River site used to be an old lumber mill, completely run down and abandoned. But Ryan saw the potential for something beautiful and profitable. Profitable. At least she was honest about the primary motivation, though I suspected the beauty aspect was secondary to the financial returns Ryan was projecting. And he thinks I should invest in this project? I asked directly. Well, he thought you might be interested, Jessica replied, her tone becoming more careful. It's not like we need the money or anything. Ryan has plenty of investors lined up. But he knows how much you've always worried about retirement security, and this could really help with that. Another expertly deployed manipulation, suggesting that my participation was optional while simultaneously appealing to my financial anxieties. Jessica had learned well from her husband, though I suspected she didn't fully recognize the calculating nature of her own words. Retirement security is important, I agreed, which is why I'm careful about financial risks. Of course, Jessica said quickly. But this isn't really risky, Mom. Ryan has done all the research, gotten all the permits, lined up the contractors. It's basically a sure thing. Sure thing. In my 40 years of working in hospitals, I had learned that the surest things were often the most dangerous, precisely because people stopped being cautious around them. Tom had taught me that any investment described as a sure thing should be avoided on principle. I'd want to understand all the details before making any decisions, I said. Absolutely, Jessica agreed. Ryan's putting together all the information for you. But Mom, I really hope you'll consider it seriously. Not just the investment, but the whole package. Moving closer, being more involved with the kids, maybe even helping Ryan with some of the project management. You have so much experience managing complex situations from your nursing career. Project management. Another role being added to my expected contributions, as if investing my money in Ryan's development wasn't sufficient involvement. I would also be expected to contribute my professional skills to ensure the project's success. That's a lot to think about, I said. I know it is, Jessica replied, her voice softening into something that sounded more like the daughter I remembered. But Mom, we really want you to be more part of our lives. The kids ask about you all the time, and I miss having you nearby. The emotional appeal was the most effective part of their entire campaign, because it touched on genuine feelings and desires that I couldn't dismiss as manipulation. I did want to be closer to Emma and Luke, did want to be more involved in their daily lives rather than relegated to occasional visits and phone calls. But I also recognized that Jessica's version of having me nearby came with conditions and expectations that had nothing to do with family connection and everything to do with convenience and financial benefit. The grandchildren would be the reward for my compliance, withdrawn if I failed to meet the obligations being placed on me. I love you and the kids more than anything, I told her honestly. But I need to make sure any decisions I make are truly in everyone's best interests, including my own. Of course, Jessica said, though something in her tone suggested she viewed my self-interest as potentially problematic. Just promise me you'll keep an open mind about everything, okay? I always try to, I replied. After hanging up, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it while reviewing my financial situation. The house was indeed worth more than I had realized, though probably not as much as Ryan had suggested. My pension provided adequate income for my current lifestyle, but wouldn't support the rent payments at Willow Creek condominiums while also allowing me to maintain any kind of financial cushion. More importantly, I realized that Tom had left me in better shape than I had fully understood. Between his life insurance, his hospital retirement account, and some investments he had made over the years, I had resources that I hadn't needed to access yet. Not enormous wealth, but enough to provide genuine security and independence if managed properly. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the conversation with Ryan and Jessica, analyzing each element of their approach with the clarity that distance provides. They had identified what they perceived as my vulnerabilities: loneliness, desire for connection with my grandchildren, and natural concern about financial security, and constructed their proposal to appeal to each one while concealing the true costs and risks involved. But they had also revealed their own vulnerabilities in the process. Ryan's need for additional investors suggested that his project wasn't as well funded as he claimed. Jessica's eagerness to have me nearby indicated that she was more overwhelmed by her chosen lifestyle than she was willing to admit. And both of them had shown a willingness to manipulate family relationships for personal benefit that spoke to character issues I could no longer ignore. The next morning brought an email from Ryan containing a glossy PDF presentation about the Columbia River development. The images were impressive, showing sleek, modern condominiums overlooking the river with the Cascade Mountains in the background. The financial projections were equally attractive, with charts showing steady appreciation and profit margins that seemed almost too good to be true. What the presentation lacked was any mention of risks, market analysis, or contingency planning. There were no comparisons to similar developments, no discussion of economic factors that might affect luxury real estate demand, no acknowledgement that development projects sometimes failed despite the best intentions and planning. It was exactly the kind of marketing material designed to excite potential investors without providing the information they would need to make informed decisions. Beautiful and compelling and essentially useless for actual evaluation purposes. I printed the presentation and spent the morning reviewing it carefully, making notes in the margins about questions and concerns. Then I called Dr. Michael Chen, who had been Tom's colleague at the hospital and had remained a friend of our family for over 20 years. Michael had also become quite successful in real estate investments after retiring from medicine, and I trusted his judgment on financial matters. "Maggie," Michael said warmly when he heard my voice. "How are you holding up? I've been meaning to call since I heard about the situation with Jessica." "You heard about that?" I asked, surprised. "Word travels in the medical community," Michael replied gently. "Several people mentioned seeing you at the country club dinner and being confused about why you were supervising the children instead of enjoying the event with your daughter." The humiliation was apparently more public than I had realized, extending beyond Jessica's immediate social circle to include people who had known our family for years. The embarrassment burned fresh, but it also confirmed that my perception of the evening hadn't been distorted by hurt feelings. "It was an interesting experience," I said dryly. "I imagine it was," Michael replied with sympathy. "What can I do for you today?" I explained Ryan's proposal, reading through the key points of his development presentation and describing the pressure I was feeling to make quick decisions about both my housing situation and the investment opportunity. Michael listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details. When I finished, he was quiet for several moments before responding. "Maggie, I'm going to be very direct with you," he said finally. "Everything you've described raises serious red flags. Legitimate development projects don't require this kind of personal pressure campaign, and successful developers don't target family members for investment capital unless they're having trouble securing funding through normal channels. That's what I was afraid of," I admitted. "The financial projections in his presentation are wildly optimistic," Michael continued. "Even in the best market conditions, luxury developments rarely see the kind of returns he's promising, especially not in the current economic climate, and the lack of risk analysis is a huge warning sign. So you think I should decline?" "I think you should run, not walk, away from this entire arrangement," Michael said firmly. "The housing suggestion, the investment opportunity, all of it. Your son-in-law is either completely inexperienced in development finance or he's deliberately misleading you about the risks involved. The blunt assessment confirmed my growing suspicions, but it was still painful to hear my concerns validated so clearly. My daughter and son-in-law were attempting to manipulate me into making financial decisions that would benefit them while potentially devastating my own security. "What would you recommend I do?" I asked. "First, don't make any quick decisions about anything," Michael advised. "Second, if you are interested in moving closer to your grandchildren, explore your options independently without Ryan's involvement. Third, if you want to invest in real estate development, there are legitimate opportunities available that don't require you to risk money you can't afford to lose." "And fourth?" I prompted, sensing he had more advice to offer. "Fourth," Michael said with a slight smile in his voice, "remember that you don't owe anyone access to your financial resources, even family members. Especially family members who have shown they're willing to manipulate your emotions to get what they want." The conversation with Michael crystallized my thinking in ways that hours of internal debate hadn't achieved. I had been trying to find ways to make Ryan's proposal work because I wanted to believe that Jessica's motives were pure and that family relationships could be rebuilt through compromise and accommodation. But Michael's perspective helped me see that some compromises were actually capitulations, and that accommodating manipulation only encouraged more of the same behavior. If Jessica and Ryan were willing to exploit my love for my grandchildren to gain access to my money, agreeing to their demands wouldn't satisfy them. It would only prove that their tactics were effective and encourage them to escalate their expectations. That afternoon, I called Ryan back. His voice was eager when he answered, clearly hoping I was calling to accept his proposal. "Maggie, perfect timing," he said before I could speak. "I was just talking to the project manager about scheduling, and we could probably get you in as an investor by the end of next week if you're ready to move forward." "Actually, Ryan, I'm calling to let you know I won't be participating in the Columbia River development," I said clearly. A moment of silence, followed by what sounded like forced laughter. "Did you have questions about the presentation? I'd be happy to clarify any details that weren't clear." "The presentation was very clear," I replied. "I simply don't think the investment is appropriate for my situation." "Ooh, Maggie, I think you might be underestimating the opportunity here," Ryan said, his tone becoming more insistent. "This isn't just about financial returns, though those are going to be excellent. This is about being part of something important, something that will benefit the entire community." "I'm sure it will be a wonderful project," I said diplomatically. "But I won't be investing." "Is this about the amount?" Ryan pressed. "Because we could probably arrange for a smaller stake if $50,000 seems too high. Maybe 25 or 30,000. The fact that he was immediately willing to have the investment amount suggested that the minimum requirements he had originally described were as flexible as everything else about his proposal. It also indicated how desperately he needed additional capital, regardless of the source or amount. "It's not about the amount," I said. "It's about the risk level and my overall financial strategy." "What risk?" Ryan asked, his voice rising slightly. "Maggie, this is one of the safest investments you could make. The location is perfect, the market demand is proven, and I've done all the groundwork. You're not going to find a better opportunity." "Perhaps not," I agreed. "But I'm not comfortable with real estate development investments at this stage of my life." "Then what about the housing situation?" Ryan asked, switching tactics rapidly. "Even if you don't want to invest in the project, moving closer to the family still makes sense. Emma and Luke need their grandmother nearby." The emotional manipulation was becoming more obvious as Ryan's desperation increased. When financial appeals failed, he immediately shifted to using my grandchildren as leverage, exactly as I had expected he would. "I'm still considering my housing options," I said truthfully. "But I'll be making those decisions based on what's best for my overall situation, not just proximity to family." "Maggie, I have to be honest with you," Ryan said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Jessica has been really counting on having your support. She's been telling everyone about how excited she is to have you more involved in the children's lives. If you back out now, it's going to be very disappointing for her. Very disappointing for her. As if my life decisions were primarily about managing Jessica's expectations rather than securing my own future. The manipulation was becoming more blatant as Ryan realized that subtle pressure wasn't working. I'm sure Jessica will understand that I need to make decisions that are right for my circumstances, I replied calmly. Will she? Ryan asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're putting your own comfort ahead of your family's needs. Jessica really needs the help with the children, and this project could secure all of our futures. I'm not sure she's going to see your refusal as understanding. There it was, the threat delivered with surgical precision. If I didn't comply with their financial and logistical demands, my relationship with Jessica and access to my grandchildren would suffer. Ryan was making it clear that my continued inclusion in the family was conditional on my usefulness to their plans. That would be unfortunate, I said quietly. But I have to make decisions I can live with, regardless of how others might react. I hope you'll reconsider, Ryan said, though his tone suggested he was already moving on to other strategies. Because I'd hate to see family relationships damaged over something that could benefit everyone involved. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet house and felt something shift inside me, like a lock clicking into place. Ryan's final threat had clarified the situation with perfect, crystalline clarity. My daughter and son-in-law viewed me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. My value to them was entirely transactional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was. The realization was painful but also liberating. For months, I had been trying to understand what I had done wrong to earn Jessica's treatment of me, how I had failed as a mother to deserve being introduced as hired help at formal dinners. But the truth was that I hadn't done anything wrong. My crime was being financially useful at a time when they needed money and convenient childcare. If they wanted to treat me like a business transaction, then perhaps it was time I started thinking like a businesswoman rather than a heartbroken mother and grandmother. Tom had always said that the most important thing in any negotiation was understanding what each party actually wanted versus what they claimed to want. What Ryan wanted was my money for his project and my free labor for his wife's lifestyle. What Jessica wanted was the social status of country club membership and committee involvement, without the responsibilities of full-time motherhood. What I wanted was genuine connection with my grandchildren and recognition as a valued family member rather than convenient help. The question was whether any arrangement could satisfy all of these desires, or whether we had moved beyond the possibility of mutual benefit into territory where someone was going to have to lose in order for others to win. As evening settled, over Salem, I made myself dinner and considered my options with new clarity. I didn't have many, but the ones I had were more powerful than Ryan and Jessica realized. Sometimes the person who seems to have the least leverage actually holds the most important cards. The game was far from over. In fact, I was beginning to suspect it was just getting interesting. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my conversation with Ryan, delivered by certified mail in a thick cream envelope that immediately caught my attention. The return address read, Whitmore and Associates, Estate Planning Attorneys. And for a moment, my heart stopped, wondering if there was some problem with Tom's will or insurance policies that I hadn't anticipated. Inside, however, was something entirely unexpected. A formal notification that I was the beneficiary of a trust fund that had matured exactly 9 months after Tom's death, established by my late husband through his financial advisor, Susan Rodriguez. The letter requested my presence at their Portland offices at my earliest convenience to discuss the distribution of assets totaling approximately $1.8 million. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered. Tom had never mentioned any trust fund, never indicated that our financial situation was anything beyond comfortable but modest. We had lived carefully throughout our marriage, saving when possible but never giving any indication that we had accumulated significant wealth. Yet here was documentation suggesting that my husband had secretly built a substantial nest egg without my knowledge. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone to call Susan Rodriguez, whose name I recognized from Tom's occasional mentions of his financial advisor, but whom I had never met personally. Her assistant scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday, and I spent the intervening days in a state of bewildered anticipation, trying to understand how Tom could have accumulated such a sum without my awareness. The drive to Portland felt surreal, as if I were living someone else's life rather than my own. Susan Rodriguez's office was located in a gleaming downtown tower, all glass and steel and marble floors that reflected the October sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The receptionist directed me to the 32nd floor, where Susan herself greeted me with a warm smile and genuine sympathy. "Mrs. Thompson, please accept my condolences on Tom's passing," she said, guiding me into a conference room with a stunning view of Mount Hood. He was not only a valued client, but someone I considered a friend. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Susan was perhaps 50 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year, but her manner was warm and unpretentious. She spread several folders across the polished conference table and began explaining the trust that Tom had established 15 years earlier. "Your husband was remarkably prescient about technology investments," Susan began, opening the first folder to reveal pages of financial documents. "In 2008, when most people were pulling money out of the stock market, Tom asked me to research some smaller technology companies that he believed had significant growth potential. She showed me records of investments in companies I had never heard of, modest amounts that seemed insignificant at the time but had grown exponentially over the years. One company in particular, a software firm that developed medical records management systems, had been acquired by a major corporation just 2 years after Tom's investment, multiplying the value by nearly 40 times. But why didn't he tell me about any of this?" I asked, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what I was learning. Susan's expression grew thoughtful. "Tom was very concerned about protecting you from potential financial exploitation," she said carefully. "He mentioned several times that your son-in-law had approached him about various investment opportunities and business ventures. Tom was worried that if you knew about the extent of your assets, you might feel pressured to share them inappropriately." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Tom had known about Ryan's manipulative tendencies years before I had recognized them myself. He had seen through the charm and social polish to understand that Ryan viewed our family as a potential source of funding for his ambitions, and he had taken steps to protect me from exactly the kind of pressure I was currently experiencing. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew," Susan confirmed gently. "Tom was very specific about the terms of the trust. You weren't to be informed of its existence until either 9 months after his death, which would give you time to adjust to widowhood and understand your real financial position, or until someone made a significant request for financial assistance that might compromise your security." "Someone did make such a request," I admitted. Susan nodded knowingly. "Tom anticipated that might happen. He left very detailed instructions about how to handle various scenarios, including specific guidance about protecting the trust assets from any potential legal challenges or family disputes." She opened another folder, revealing documents that demonstrated the breadth of Tom's planning. Not only had he accumulated significant wealth through careful investing, but he had structured the trust in ways that made it virtually impossible for anyone else to access or challenge. There were provisions for my long-term care, educational funds for any grandchildren, and even instructions for charitable donations if I chose to make them. The total current value is actually closer to $3 million, Susan continued, showing me the most recent portfolio statements. The trust has continued to grow since Tom's death, and the investments are structured to provide you with substantial monthly income while preserving the principal. $3 million. The figure was so large I could barely process it. I had spent the past 8 months worrying about stretching my pension to cover basic expenses, carefully budgeting for groceries and utilities, while sitting on a fortune I didn't know existed. "What kind of monthly income are we talking about?" I asked. "Approximately $8,000, Susan replied. "Enough to live very comfortably without touching the principal, and with built-in adjustments for inflation and market fluctuations." $8,000 a month. More than twice what I had earned during my highest-paid years as a pediatric nurse. More than enough to live independently and securely, without depending on anyone else for financial support. Tom had given me the ultimate gift. Freedom from the exact kind of manipulation that Ryan and Jessica were attempting. "There's something else," Susan said, opening a sealed envelope that had been paperclipped to the trust documents. "Tom left you a personal letter to be delivered when you accessed the trust." The letter was in Tom's familiar handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death, when he was still relatively healthy but clearly planning for contingencies. My eyes filled with tears as I read his words. "My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've discovered the secret I've been keeping from you for 15 years. I'm sorry for not telling you about our investments, but I needed to know you were protected from people who might try to take advantage of your generous heart. I've watched Ryan manipulate situations for his own benefit since he first joined our family, and I've seen how he views our resources as potential solutions to his problems. I didn't want you to feel pressured to fund his schemes or to feel guilty about having money when others around you might be struggling. This trust is your security, your independence, your guarantee that no one can ever make you feel small or unworthy because of your financial situation. Use it to live the life you deserve, to make choices based on what makes you happy, rather than what others expect from you. You are worth so much more than the roles other people want you to play. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. All. My love, Tom." I was crying openly by the time I finished reading, overwhelmed by the depth of Tom's love and foresight. Even from beyond the grave, he was still protecting me, still ensuring that I had the resources to maintain my dignity and independence. Susan handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I composed myself. "Tom also left instructions about discretion," she said gently. "He was very concerned that knowledge of your assets not become public information, particularly within your family, unless you specifically chose to share it." "Why would he be concerned about that?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because money changes relationships," Susan replied simply. "People begin to view you differently when they know you have significant assets. They start to see opportunities rather than just family connections. Tom wanted you to have the choice about when and how to reveal your financial situation." The wisdom of Tom's approach was becoming clearer with each revelation. If Ryan and Jessica knew about the trust, their manipulation would undoubtedly escalate. Instead of pressuring me to invest $50,000 in Ryan's development project, they would be expecting much larger contributions. Instead of asking me to move to an expensive rental apartment, they would be suggesting I purchase something far beyond my needs to demonstrate my commitment to being part of their social circle. "What would you recommend I do?" I asked. Susan smiled. Tom anticipated that question too. He suggested that you take time to adjust to your new financial reality before making any major decisions. Maybe travel, explore new interests, consider what kind of life you want to build for yourself, now that you have the resources to build any life you choose. The idea of having choices, real choices based on my own desires rather than financial limitations or family obligations, was intoxicating. For the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness or anxiety. I felt possibility. "There is one immediate decision you might want to consider," Susan continued. "Tom instructed me to research housing options in the Riverside area. In case you decided you wanted to be closer to your grandchildren, but didn't want to be dependent on your daughter and son-in-law for living arrangements. She handed me another folder containing information about several properties, condominiums, townhouses, and even small single-family homes, all in excellent condition and all within my new budget. The prices ranged from reasonable to expensive, but all were presented as viable options rather than financial stretches. Tom thought you might want independence and proximity, Susan explained. The ability to be involved in your grandchildren's lives without being beholden to their parents for housing or financial support. One property in particular caught my attention. A charming craftsman cottage just 6 blocks from Emma and Luke's school, with a small garden and enough space for overnight visits. The price was $485,000, well within my means, but completely outside what Ryan and Jessica would expect me to be able to afford. "This one looks interesting," I said, pointing to the cottage listing. "It's been on the market for only 2 weeks," Susan replied. "The owners are relocating for work and motivated to sell quickly. Tom specifically flagged that neighborhood because of its proximity to quality schools and family-friendly atmosphere." "Could I see it?" I asked. "I can arrange a showing for this afternoon if you'd like," Susan offered. "The listing agent is a colleague of mine, and she could meet us there at your convenience." The cottage was even more charming in person than in the photographs. Built in 1925, it had been lovingly maintained and updated with modern conveniences, while preserving its original character. Hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, a fireplace that would be perfect for cozy evenings with the grandchildren. The kitchen was small but efficient, and there were 2 bedrooms upstairs that would be ideal for Emma and Luke's sleepovers. The backyard was what sold me completely. A small but well-designed garden with mature fruit trees, raised beds for vegetables, and a patio that would be perfect for summer barbecues. I could imagine Emma helping me plant flowers and Luke climbing the apple tree, creating the kind of memories that had nothing to do with country clubs or social status. "I'd like to make an offer," I told Susan as we walked through the house a second time. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This is a significant decision to make so quickly." "I'm sure," I replied, and for the first time in months, I truly was. Tom was right about wanting independence and proximity. This place would give me both. The offer was accepted within hours, with a closing date set for 3 weeks later. As I drove back to Salem that evening, my mind was spinning with the implications of everything that had happened. In the space of a single day, I had discovered that I was financially independent, that Tom had been protecting me from manipulation I was only beginning to recognize, and that I had options I had never imagined. More importantly, I now understood the true nature of Ryan's desperation. His Columbia River development project wasn't the sure thing he had presented it as. If it were truly as well-funded and low-risk as he claimed, he wouldn't need to pressure family members for investment capital. His targeting of me specifically suggested that his other funding sources had fallen through or never existed in the first place. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as I arranged financing for the cottage purchase, scheduled inspections, and began the process of putting my Salem house on the market. I also spent considerable time researching Ryan's Columbia River project, using my new financial resources to hire a private investigator who specialized in commercial real estate ventures. What the investigator discovered was illuminating and disturbing. The project had indeed received initial approval from the City Planning Commission, but several key permits were still pending and facing significant opposition from environmental groups concerned about riverfront development. 2 of Ryan's primary investors had withdrawn their support after discovering that he had overstated both the project timeline and the profit projections. Most concerning, Ryan had been using preliminary investment funds to cover personal expenses and other business debts, a practice that bordered on fraud if investors weren't properly notified. The project was hemorrhaging money before construction had even begun, and Ryan was desperately seeking additional capital to keep it afloat long enough to secure proper financing. Armed with this information, I began to understand the true scope of the manipulation that Ryan and Jessica had been attempting. This wasn't just about getting me to invest in a questionable business venture. It was about using my emotional connection to my grandchildren to secure funding for a project that was already failing, potentially devastating my financial security in the process. The realization filled me with a cold anger that was quite different from the hurt and confusion I had felt after the country club dinner. This was calculated exploitation of the worst kind, using family relationships as tools for financial gain while concealing the true risks involved. I spent the weekend considering my options, weighing different approaches to dealing with what I had learned. I could simply continue to refuse Ryan's investment requests and hope that he would eventually find other funding sources. I could confront him directly with what I had discovered and demand that he stop pressuring me for money. Or I could take a more proactive approach to protecting both myself and any other potential victims of his schemes. The decision came to me on Sunday evening, as I was reviewing the trust documents Susan had given me. Tom had provided me with more than just financial security. He had given me the power to make choices based on what was right, rather than what was convenient or expected. Monday morning, I called Jessica. Her voice was strained when she answered, and I could hear Emma and Luke arguing in the background about something trivial. "Mom, I'm sorry, but this isn't a great time," she began immediately. "I'm trying to get the kids ready for school, and Ryan is already at a meeting with potential investors." "This won't take long," I said calmly. "I wanted to let you know that I've decided to move to Riverside after all." The change in her tone was immediate and dramatic. "Really? Mom, that's wonderful. Ryan will be so excited. Have you looked at the apartments at Willow Creek like he suggested?" "Actually, I found something else," I said. "A small house near the children's school. I'll be closing on it next week." A brief pause. "A house? But Mom, houses in Riverside are so expensive. Are you sure you can afford the mortgage payments?" "I'm paying cash," I said simply. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cash? Mom, where did you get that kind of money?" "Your father was better with investments than either of us realized," I replied, which was true if incomplete. "It turns out I'm in better financial shape than I thought." "How much better?" Jessica asked, and something in her tone made me grateful for Tom's warnings about discretion. "Comfortable enough to buy a house and live independently," I said, deliberately vague. "I thought you'd be happy that I'll be nearby without needing help with housing or expenses." "Of course I'm happy," Jessica said quickly, though she sounded more shocked than pleased. "It's just such a surprise. You never mentioned having that kind of savings." "I didn't know about it myself until recently," I admitted. "Your father arranged things to mature after his death. Apparently he wanted to make sure I was taken care of." "That's so like Dad," Jessica said, and for a moment her voice carried genuine warmth. "He always worried about everyone else before himself." "Yes, he did," I agreed, "which is why I'm sure he'd want me to make careful decisions about how to use what he left me." Another pause, during which I could almost hear Jessica's mind racing through the implications of what I had revealed. If I had enough money to buy a house with cash, I clearly had substantial resources that she and Ryan hadn't known about. Resources that could potentially solve their financial problems if accessed properly. "Mom, this is incredible news," Jessica said finally. "We should celebrate. Why don't you come for dinner this weekend? Ryan would love to congratulate you on the house purchase." "I'm sure he would," I thought. "That sounds lovely," I said aloud. "I'll look forward to it." "And Mom?" Jessica added, her voice taking on a careful tone. "Maybe you could bring some information about your new financial situation? Ryan is so good with investments and financial planning. He might have some suggestions about how to make the most of Dad's gift." There it was, exactly as Tom had predicted. Within minutes of learning that I had unexpected resources, Jessica was already positioning Ryan as someone who should have input into how I managed them. The manipulation was so predictable, it was almost laughable. "I'll keep that in mind," I said neutrally. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen and marveled at how quickly the dynamics had shifted. For weeks, Ryan and Jessica had been pressuring me to make financial sacrifices to support their lifestyle and business ventures. Now that they suspected I had significant assets, they were positioning themselves as advisors who could help me manage my newfound wealth. What they didn't understand was that Tom's true gift wasn't just the money. It was the knowledge of their true character and the tools to protect myself from their exploitation. The trust fund had given me more than financial independence. It had given me the power to observe their behavior from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The dinner invitation was clearly the beginning of a new phase in their campaign, one that would probably involve much larger requests and more sophisticated manipulation techniques. But this time, I would be ready for them. This time, I would be the one controlling the conversation. I spent the rest of the week preparing for what I expected would be a very interesting evening. The cottage closing went smoothly, and I found myself the owner of a charming home 6 blocks from my grandchildren's school, with enough financial resources to live comfortably for the rest of my life without depending on anyone else for support. More importantly, I had gained something that Ryan and Jessica had been trying to take away from me: the power to make choices based on my own values and priorities rather than their expectations and demands. Tom had given me the ultimate protection against manipulation, the knowledge that I didn't need anything from people who were willing to exploit my love for my family. The game had changed completely, though Ryan and Jessica didn't realize it yet. They thought they were dealing with a lonely widow who could be pressured into making decisions that benefited them. Instead, they were about to encounter someone who had both the resources and the knowledge to turn their own tactics against them. I was looking forward to Saturday dinner more than I had looked forward to anything in months. It was time to find out just how far they were willing to go when they thought there was real money at stake. Friday evening, I received a text from Jessica. "So excited for tomorrow. Ryan has some amazing ideas about investment opportunities that could really benefit you. Can't wait to share them." I smiled as I read the message. Amazing investment opportunities. I was sure they would be fascinating to hear about, particularly now that I had the resources to investigate them properly and the knowledge to recognize manipulation when I encountered it. The weekend couldn't come fast enough. After months of feeling powerless and confused, I was finally ready to take control of the situation. Tom had given me the tools I needed. Now it was time to use them. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather for November, and I drove to Jessica and Ryan's house with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in months. The cottage keys were in my purse, along with carefully selected documents that would help me navigate whatever conversation was waiting for me. I had spent considerable time that week preparing for various scenarios, though I suspected that Ryan's approach would be more aggressive now that he believed I had substantial resources at my disposal. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but my perspective had changed dramatically. Instead of seeing an impressive home that represented success and sophistication, I now saw a financial burden that was clearly straining my daughter's marriage and forcing her to make compromises that were slowly eroding her character. The manicured lawn and expensive landscaping represented thousands of dollars in monthly maintenance costs that could have been better spent on the children's education or Jessica's personal fulfillment. Ryan answered the door with a smile that was brighter and more genuine than any I had received from him in years. He was dressed in what I had learned to recognize as his important meeting attire, a navy blazer with gold buttons and khaki slacks that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothing in 6 months. But now, instead of feeling intimidated by his polished appearance, I simply saw someone who was investing in costume rather than substance. "Maggie, congratulations," he said, embracing me with uncharacteristic warmth. Jessica told me about your house purchase. What wonderful news. Your husband really knew what he was doing with those investments. Yes, he did, I agreed, allowing him to take my coat and guide me into the living room where Jessica was waiting with Emma and Luke. The children ran to me immediately, their enthusiasm unaffected by the adult complexities swirling around them. Grandma Maggie, Mommy says you bought a house near our school, Emma said excitedly. Can we see it? Does it have a yard for playing? It has a lovely yard, I confirmed, hugging them both. With apple trees, you can climb and space for a garden. Maybe you can help me plant flowers this spring. Luke bounced on his toes with excitement. And can we have sleepovers? Real sleepovers with pancakes in the morning? As many as your parents will allow, I promised, glancing at Jessica, who was watching our interaction with a complex expression that seemed to mix genuine happiness with calculation. She looked stunning as always, wearing a burgundy sweater that complemented her hair color and jewelry that caught the light when she moved. But I noticed signs of strain that I had missed before. Tension around her eyes, a forced quality to her smile, and the way she kept checking her phone as if expecting important news that might not be good. Mom, I'm so happy you'll be nearby, she said, rising to hug me. The children have been talking about nothing else since I told them. They're already planning all the things they want to do at your new house. I'm looking forward to it, I said honestly. Though I hope you understand that my moving closer doesn't mean I'll be available for childcare on demand. I have my own life to build too. Ryan's expression flickered briefly, as if he hadn't considered that my increased proximity might come with boundaries rather than increased availability. Of course, he said quickly. We just think it's wonderful that you'll be part of the daily fabric of the children's lives. The phrase daily fabric sounded rehearsed, as if he had been practicing ways to frame my presence as beneficial for the grandchildren while concealing his own expectations about my contributions to their household management. I filed the observation, away for later reference. Dinner was elaborate by their usual standards, with courses that suggested Jessica had been cooking all day. The conversation remained light through the appetizer and main course, focusing on the children's school activities and my plans for decorating the cottage. But I could sense the tension building as Ryan occasionally glanced at Jessica with expressions that seemed to carry meaning I wasn't meant to understand. After Emma and Luke were excused to watch television in the family room, Ryan poured wine for the adults and settled back in his chair with the air of someone preparing for serious business. Maggie, I have to say how impressed I am with your husband's financial acumen, he began, swirling his wine in a way that I suspected was meant to convey sophistication. Not many people have the foresight to structure investments that continue, growing after death. You must be sitting quite comfortably now. I'm very grateful for Tom's planning, I replied carefully. He was always more financially savvy than I gave him credit for. Jessica mentioned that the trust matured recently, Ryan continued. That must have been quite a pleasant surprise. Did Tom leave instructions about how he wanted you to manage the assets? The question was posed casually, but I recognized it as fishing for information about the scope of my resources and any restrictions on how I could use them. Tom's letter had warned me about exactly this kind of probing, and I was prepared for it. He left some general guidance, I said vaguely. Mostly about being careful with large financial decisions and not rushing into anything without proper research. Ryan nodded sagely. Very wise advice, though I imagine the current investment climate might present some challenges for someone who isn't deeply familiar with market dynamics. Have you given thought to professional financial management? I have an excellent advisor, I replied, which was true. Susan Rodriguez had agreed to continue managing the trust assets and had already demonstrated far more competence than I expected Ryan possessed. Wonderful, Ryan said, though something in his tone suggested he found my answer less than satisfactory. Though I hope you'll consider that having someone local who understands your personal situation might be beneficial. Someone who knows your family priorities and can help align your investments with your values. Someone local who understands your personal situation. The meaning was transparent. Ryan was positioning himself as a better choice than whatever professional advisor I might have, based on his proximity and supposed understanding of my needs. It was exactly the kind of self-serving logic I had come to expect from him. "That's very thoughtful," I said noncommittally. Jessica jumped into the conversation at this point, her voice carrying a brightness that seemed forced. "Mom, Ryan has some really exciting opportunities that might interest you. Investment projects that could provide great returns while also benefiting the local community." "Oh?" I said, pretending ignorance, though I knew exactly where this was heading. Ryan leaned forward with enthusiasm, clearly interpreting my mild interest as an opening. "The Columbia River development is finally moving into its next phase," he said. "We've secured most of the primary funding, but there are still opportunities for private investors to join at the ground level." "I thought you said all the investor positions were filled," I observed, remembering his earlier claims about the project being fully funded. A brief hesitation, followed by a smooth recovery. "The original positions were filled, but success breeds success. The preliminary work has been so promising that we've decided to expand the scope of the project, which creates additional investment opportunities." Additional investment opportunities. In other words, the original funding had fallen through, and he was desperately seeking replacement capital from anyone willing to provide it. The private investigator's report had been quite clear about the project's financial problems, but I was curious to see how Ryan would present the situation to someone he believed had substantial resources. "Tell me more about these expanded opportunities," I said, settling back in my chair as if genuinely interested. Ryan's face lit up with the fervor of someone who believed he was about to close a significant deal. He launched into a detailed presentation about the Columbia River project, describing luxury condominiums with river views, high-end retail spaces, and marina facilities that would attract wealthy buyers from throughout the Pacific Northwest. What was fascinating was how dramatically his projections had improved since our last conversation. Where he had previously promised 30% returns, he was now suggesting that early investors might see profits of 50% or more within 2 years. The number of planned units had increased, the projected selling prices had risen, and the timeline had become more aggressive. "The beauty of getting in at this stage," Ryan explained, pulling out his phone to show me architectural renderings, "is that you're basically buying at wholesale prices. Once construction begins and the marketing campaign launches, comparable positions will cost significantly more." "How much more?" I asked. "Probably double," Ryan said confidently. "Maybe triple, depending on market conditions. That's why timing is so crucial with opportunities like this." Jessica nodded enthusiastically beside him. "It's like buying Amazon stock in 1997, she said. "The people who recognized the potential early made incredible returns." The comparison was telling, suggesting that Jessica either didn't understand the difference between investing in an established company with proven revenue streams and speculating on a local real estate development, or that she was consciously using misleading analogies to make Ryan's proposal sound more appealing. "What kind of investment minimums are we talking about?" I asked. "For family members, I could arrange something as low as $100,000, Ryan replied. Though, obviously, larger investments would provide proportionally better returns. $100,000. Exactly twice what he had initially suggested when he thought I was living on a pension and modest savings. Now that he suspected I had substantial assets, his expectations had increased accordingly. It was a perfect demonstration of how knowledge of wealth changed people's expectations and demands. "That's a significant amount," I observed. "It is," Ryan agreed readily. "But consider the potential returns. Even at the conservative estimate of 40% profit, you'd be looking at $140,000 in 2 years. That's income of $20,000 per year, tax-free if structured properly." "Tax-free?" I questioned. Capital. Gains rates are much lower than ordinary income tax rates, Ryan explained, though his understanding of tax law seemed shallow. Plus, there are various strategies for deferring gains if you reinvest in similar projects. Similar projects. The implication that this development was just the beginning of a series of investment opportunities I could participate in, creating an ongoing financial relationship between us that would extend far beyond a single transaction. It sounds very promising, I said, though I'd want to see detailed financial projections and market analysis before making any decisions. Absolutely, Ryan said eagerly. I can have my project manager prepare a complete investment package for you. Cash flow projections, comparable sales data, construction timelines, everything you'd need to make an informed decision. That would be helpful, I agreed, though I should mention that my advisor has been quite cautious about real estate investments. She's concerned about market volatility and the risks inherent in development projects. Ryan's expression darkened slightly at the mention of my advisor's caution. Well, advisors who don't understand local markets often err on the side of excessive conservatism, he said dismissively. They're managing portfolios for hundreds of clients and can't give proper attention to unique opportunities like this. She's actually quite knowledgeable about commercial real estate, I replied mildly. She's handled several major development projects in Portland. This information clearly troubled Ryan, though he tried to hide his concern. Portland is a different market than Riverside, he said. The demographics, the growth patterns, the regulatory environment. What works there doesn't necessarily apply here. That's why I'd want her to review any proposal carefully, I said, to make sure I understand all the risks involved. Of course, Ryan agreed, though his enthusiasm had diminished noticeably. Though I hope you'll keep in mind that opportunities like this don't wait for lengthy analysis. The best positions go to investors who can move quickly when they recognize value. More artificial urgency, designed to pressure me into making decisions before I could properly evaluate the risks or seek independent advice. It was becoming clear that Ryan's entire approach depended on preventing potential investors from conducting thorough due diligence. Jessica sensed that the conversation was not progressing as Ryan had hoped, and she jumped in with a different angle. Mom, beyond the financial returns, think about what this project could mean for the community. Quality development that creates jobs and increases property values for everyone in the area. That's certainly important, I agreed, though I imagine projects like this also create some controversy. Environmental concerns, traffic impact, that sort of thing. Ryan's expression tightened further. There are always some people who oppose progress, he said curtly, but the City Planning Commission has been very supportive, and we've addressed all the legitimate environmental concerns. This was a fascinating contradiction to what my investigator had discovered about the significant opposition the project was facing from environmental groups and the pending permit challenges. Ryan was either unaware of the extent of the problems or was deliberately concealing them from potential investors. What about financing? I asked. I assume a project this size requires substantial loans in addition to private investment. The banking relationships are solid, Ryan replied, though he provided no specifics. We're working with several major lenders who specialize in commercial development. And they're comfortable with the project timeline and profit projections? I pressed. A slight hesitation. Banks are always conservative in their initial assessments, Ryan said. But as the project progresses and market conditions continue to improve, their confidence increases accordingly. Banks are always conservative. A non-answer that suggested the lending institutions were actually expressing significant skepticism about the project's viability, which would explain why Ryan was seeking private investors to replace institutional funding. I decided to test the waters more directly. What happens if the project faces delays or cost overruns? Development projects often encounter unexpected complications. Ryan's smile became strained. "We've built substantial contingencies into all our projections," he said. "Plus, the project management team has extensive experience with similar developments. They know how to anticipate and handle challenges." "But if something did go wrong," I persisted, "what kind of protections would private investors have?" "Maggie, nothing is going to go wrong," Jessica interjected, her voice carrying a note of desperation that I hadn't heard before. "Ryan has been working on this for over a year. He's done all the research, secured all the approvals, lined up all the contractors. This isn't some speculative venture. It's a sure thing." Sure thing. The phrase that Tom had taught me to view as the ultimate warning sign. Nothing in business was ever a sure thing, and anyone who claimed otherwise was either naive or deliberately misleading. "I'm sure Ryan has done excellent work," I said diplomatically. "But prudent investing requires considering all possible scenarios, even unlikely ones." Ryan's facade of patient professionalism was beginning to crack under the pressure of my questions. "Look, Maggie," he said, his tone becoming more direct. "Every investment involves some degree of risk. But this project has been structured to minimize those risks while maximizing returns. The location is perfect, the market demand is proven, and the profit margins are exceptional. Exceptional profit margins often indicate exceptional risks," I observed quietly. "Or exceptional opportunities," Ryan countered. "The choice is whether to be part of something transformative or to let excessive caution prevent you from benefiting from the growth happening all around us." The implication was clear. If I didn't invest in his project, I was being overly fearful and missing out on obvious opportunities. It was a classic manipulation technique, framing reasonable caution as irrational fear and presenting speculation as common sense. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," I said, "but I've learned that major financial decisions require careful consideration. I'll need time to review any materials you provide and discuss them with my advisor." "How much time?" Ryan asked, making no effort to conceal his impatience. "As much time as necessary to make an informed decision," I replied calmly. The conversation continued for another hour, with Ryan becoming increasingly frustrated by my refusal to commit to quick action. He tried various approaches, appealing to my desire to help family, emphasizing the time-sensitive nature of the opportunity, and even suggesting that my hesitation indicated a lack of trust in his judgment. What became increasingly clear was that Ryan was operating under significant pressure himself. His project was apparently facing serious financial difficulties, and he needed immediate capital injection to prevent collapse. My potential investment wasn't just about improving returns, it was about keeping his entire venture afloat. Jessica tried to support Ryan's arguments, but her contributions revealed her own lack of understanding about the details of the project. She repeated his talking points about profit potential and community benefits, but couldn't answer specific questions about market analysis or risk assessment. It was obvious that she was supporting the project based on faith in her husband rather than independent evaluation of its merits. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave, Ryan made one final attempt to pressure me into a commitment. "Maggie, I hope you understand that this opportunity won't be available indefinitely," he said as he walked me to my car. "The investor group is filling up quickly, and I can only hold positions for family members for so long." "I understand," I replied. "And I appreciate your thinking of me. But I'm sure you understand that I need to be responsible with the resources Tom left me." "Of course," Ryan said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Just remember that being too conservative can be as risky as being too aggressive. Inflation erodes the value of money sitting in low-yield investments." It was a sophisticated argument, appealing to legitimate concerns about preserving purchasing power while ignoring the much greater risks involved in speculative investments. Ryan was clearly more financially knowledgeable than I had initially realized, which made his manipulation more dangerous rather than less. The drive home gave me time to process everything I had observed during the evening, Ryan's desperation was becoming more apparent as his project faced increasing difficulties. Jessica's support seemed to be based more on wishful thinking than realistic assessment. And both of them were clearly expecting me to provide financial solutions to problems they had created through poor judgment and overextension. What was most disturbing was how quickly they had adjusted their expectations once they learned about my improved financial situation. Instead of being grateful that I was no longer a potential burden on their resources, they immediately began viewing me as a source of capital for their own ventures. The next morning, I called Susan Rodriguez to update her on the conversation and ask for her advice about how to handle Ryan's continued pressure. "Everything you've described confirms what we suspected about his financial situation," Susan said after I recounted the evening's events. "Desperate developers often target family members and friends because they can use emotional leverage that isn't available with institutional investors." "What would you recommend I do?" I asked. "Document everything," Susan advised. "Keep records of all his investment proposals, promises, and pressure tactics. If this escalates to legal challenges or family disputes, you'll want evidence of his behavior patterns." "Do you think it will escalate that far?" I asked. "People facing financial ruin sometimes make extreme choices," Susan replied carefully. "Ryan's project is apparently hemorrhaging money, and he may see your resources as his only chance of avoiding complete failure. That kind of desperation can lead to increasingly aggressive behavior." The warning proved to be prescient. Over. The next week, I received daily calls from Ryan, each one more insistent than the last. He provided updated project materials that showed even more optimistic projections than before, as if improving the numbers on paper could make the underlying problems disappear. Jessica also began calling more frequently, ostensibly to discuss plans for my move to the cottage, but actually to reinforce Ryan's investment pitch. Her approach was more subtle than her husband's, focusing on family loyalty and shared success rather than financial returns. "Mom, I know Ryan can seem pushy about the investment opportunity," she said during one such call, "but he's just so excited about the potential for all of us to benefit together. He sees this as a way for our family to build real wealth for the next generation." "I want what's best for the family too," I replied, "which is why I need to be careful about any major financial decisions." "But what if being too careful means missing out on something that could secure Emma and Luke's futures?" Jessica pressed. "College costs are going to be enormous by the time they're ready. This kind of return could pay for their educations without anyone having to struggle." The appeal to my grandchildren's welfare was emotionally powerful, as she knew it would be, but I recognized it as manipulation nonetheless. Emma and Luke's educational needs could be met through the trust funds Tom had already established, without requiring me to risk additional money on speculative investments. "The children's education is important," I agreed, "but there are safer ways to provide for that than real estate speculation." "Safer, maybe," Jessica conceded, "but not as potentially rewarding. Mom, this could change everything for our family. We could finally have the kind of financial security that Dad always wanted for us. Financial security through high risk. Investments was a contradiction in terms, but I recognized that Jessica had been living with Ryan's optimistic projections for so long that she had lost sight of the difference between possibility and probability. The pressure continued to build throughout the week, with Ryan becoming increasingly agitated as I maintained my position of wanting more time for analysis. His calls became longer and more argumentative, with him challenging my advisor's competence and questioning my commitment to family success. By Friday, his approach had shifted from persuasion to something closer to demands. "Maggie, I need an answer," he said during our latest conversation. "The window for this investment opportunity is closing, and I can't hold your position much longer." "I understand your timeline concerns," I replied, "but I'm not ready to make a decision yet." "Not ready?" Ryan's voice rose with frustration. "How much analysis do you need? I've given you every piece of information you could possibly want." "You've given me projections and promises," I corrected. but I haven't seen independent market analysis, verified financial statements, or documentation of your regulatory approvals." "Those are confidential business documents," Ryan replied quickly. "I can't share proprietary information with everyone who expresses interest." "But you're asking me to invest $100,000 based on your word alone," I pointed out. "My word should be worth something," Ryan said, his tone becoming accusatory. "I'm your son-in-law, part of your family. That should count for something in your decision-making process. Family loyalty is a substitute for due diligence." It was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that Tom had warned me about, and I was beginning to understand why he had been so concerned about protecting me from Ryan's schemes. "Family relationships make careful analysis more important, not less," I replied. "I would never want to put our family harmony at risk by making an investment that didn't work out well." "It's going to work out perfectly," Ryan insisted, "but only if we can move forward quickly enough to take advantage of the current market conditions." The conversation ended with Ryan clearly frustrated by my continued resistance. I spent the weekend reviewing all the materials he had provided, comparing them with the independent research I had commissioned, and preparing for what I expected would be an escalating campaign of pressure. I was right to prepare. The following week brought a series of developments that demonstrated just how far Ryan was willing to go to secure my investment, and how quickly family relationships could deteriorate when money was involved. The emergency call came at dawn. Jessica's voice was frantic as she begged me to come over immediately. When I arrived, I found them surrounded by scattered legal documents and empty coffee cups. Ryan looked defeated, his usual polish completely gone. "The investors pulled out," he announced without preamble. 18 months of work down the drain. They're claiming environmental issues, but it's all just excuses." Jessica gripped my hand desperately. "Mom, we need someone to step in as lead investor. $500,000 would save everything." I listened to their pitch with growing clarity about what was really happening. This wasn't about opportunity anymore. This was about desperation, and they expected me to fund their failing venture. "I've had the project investigated," I told them calmly. "The environmental problems are real, and the financial management has been questionable. I won't be investing." Ryan exploded with rage, accusing me of betraying family. Jessica delivered her ultimatum with cold precision: choose money or family, because there was no room for both. When I refused to be blackmailed, they cut me off completely. Months passed without contact with my grandchildren. Eventually, the project collapsed exactly as predicted, taking their house and Ryan's business with it. The reconciliation came through Emma's secret birthday call, her innocent voice asking why I didn't want to be part of their family anymore. That broke Jessica's pride, leading to tearful apologies and admission that she'd been wrong about everything. Today, they live in my cottage's converted basement, rebuilding their lives with dignity rather than desperation. Jessica discovered her own strength without Ryan's manipulative influence. The children thrived in our stable, loving environment. Tom's inheritance hadn't just protected my money, it had protected our family's soul, teaching us all the difference between authentic love and transactional relationships. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.